This is Walden, Colorado, mid-March 2026, and this man is standing here looking at something that shouldn't exist. For those rooted in these mountains, March always carries a promise from nature. The pond will retain its winter ice, and the land will be asleep, waiting for the snow to melt. But this year, that promise has been betrayed. No ice, no water. What is evaporating before our eyes is not just a pond, but the very reliability of the seasons, a spring that has not arrived at its proper time. When you pull your perspective beyond the small pond in Walden, the data reveals a harsh truth. The planet is feverish. By mid-April 2026, the U.S. Drought Monitor confirmed that much of the continental United States was locked in a drought. Nearly 100% of Oklahoma was scorching. The entire southeast was awash in red. But the most haunting number was the Palmer Drought Severity Index, PDSI, for last March. It was the highest number ever recorded in all historical data since 1895. There hasn't been a March this dry in 131 years. The media is trying to reassure you by calling this a return to the Dust Bowl disaster of 1934. They want you to believe that we've overcome it before and will overcome it again. But that comparison is a deadly illusion. The 1934 Dust Bowl struck a sparsely populated West. In 2026, we have 40 million people, thousands of massive data centers, and megacities locked down to an infrastructure absolutely dependent on water. In 1934, people could leave their land to migrate. In 2026, America has not a millimeter of safety margin left to retreat. If March behaved with the brutality of midsummer, then what will this summer look like? Looking at this rushing water, you might think the system is still functioning perfectly. But in the rhythm of hydrology, a river flowing too fast in April is not a sign of life. It's the death knell for summer. To understand why the American West is heading into an irreversible crisis, you have to understand the only thing keeping this region alive, the snowpack. The American West doesn't live on rain. It lives on a massive natural water bank located on the mountaintops. Its mechanism used to be perfect. Snow accumulates as a reserve throughout the harsh winter. When spring arrives, this reserve is released slowly. This amount of water, equivalent to tens of billions of cubic meters, flows down precisely when farms and cities need it most during the peak of the hot season. That's the heartbeat of the West. But in 2026, this bank is declaring bankruptcy en masse. The unusual heat shock in March triggered a deadly chain reaction. In the Colorado River Basin, the Rio Grande, and even the Sierra Nevada, the snow didn't melt. It evaporated and forcibly flowed down. A drought.gov report in early April confirmed the collapse. Snow water equivalents, SWE in Washington state, plummeted dramatically, forcing authorities to declare a drought emergency in the middle of spring. The core issue wasn't just little snowfall. The issue was that the water supply calendar for half the continent had been torn apart. This is the deadly trap nature has set, the mismatch. When billions of gallons of water crash down in April, the massive reservoirs can't hold all the sudden surge. To avoid spring flooding, engineers are forced to release the water. It flows into the ocean or evaporates into the air. By the time June and July arrive, when the fields are parched and millions of air conditioners in Phoenix and Las Vegas are running at full power, that reservoir is empty. We built our entire modern society, our billion-dollar megacities and massive food supply chains, on a 20th century climate calendar. A calendar that dictated snow would hold water and spring would arrive on schedule. In 2026, that calendar will officially cease to exist. If the West has lost its only water-holding machine for the summer, what will happen when the real fire arrives? In the American subconscious, drought is a disease endemic to the West. When we hear the word drought, our brains automatically conjure images of the Nevada desert, the cracked valleys of California, or the dry lake beds of Arizona. We always believed that, at the other end of the continent, the Southeast with its abundant rains, dense forests, and flooded swamps would be a safe buffer zone. But 2026 leaves no safe zone on the map. Welcome to the era of double drought America. The data doesn't lie. Right now, 97% of the southeastern United States is locked in extreme drought. Florida is experiencing its most devastating drought year since the turn of the millennium. The thirsty atmosphere has turned into a giant sponge, sucking moisture from the land faster than nature can compensate. What you're seeing in the Appalachian Mountains is a picture that completely defies biological laws. Ecologically speaking, broadleaf forests aren't designed to catch fire in the spring. Young leaves are full of water, acting as a natural fire break. But the abnormal heat shock has roasted these forests from the inside out. Humidity plummeted to 25%, turning even the wettest vegetation into massive infernos. This isn't a natural wildfire season. This is the demise of the ecosystem. In Florida, a state bordered by the sea on two sides, this paradox becomes even more bitter. In just the first 4 months of 2026, more than 1,500 wildfires ripped through the state. Even the ground beneath their feet is burning. The millennia-old waterlogged peatlands are drying up, smoldering from beneath the surface, incinerating the entire root system and releasing toxic air. Evacuation orders are being issued in places accustomed to sea storms, not firestorms. The West is losing snow. The East is losing moisture. Both of the continent's two largest natural defense systems are collapsing simultaneously on the same map. If both the arid and the humid regions are failing at the same time, what is truly controlling 2026? The answer to the question of what is driving 2026 doesn't lie in a single event. Meteorologists and supercomputer models aren't looking at today's weather. They're looking at the static pressure that's crushing this system. The 2026 drought will be so devastating not because it's a single disaster. It's a phenomenon that science calls a compound drought. This is the result of the perfect convergence of three destructive forces pressing down on the North American continent at once. Three crushing machines that scientists warned about decades ago, but no one believed they would strike so early and so intensely. The first force, climate change. The planet's baseline temperature has warmed, turning the atmosphere into a giant dehumidifier, draining water from the soil and vegetation faster than ever before. The second force, an unusually long La Niña cycle, deflecting the jet stream and preventing rain-bearing storms from reaching the South and the Great Plains. And finally, the fatal blow. The third force, the March 2026 heat shock, an anomaly that swept across the continent, acting as a spark, burning up the little snow reserves and scorching the ecosystem's moisture before spring even began. Any of these forces appearing individually, our infrastructure might still be able to withstand. But when they converge, they trigger an incredibly merciless, self-amplifying feedback mechanism. Look at this death loop. High temperatures dry out the soil. Dry soil loses its ability to evaporate water to cool the surrounding air. The consequence? The ground absorbs more solar radiation, pushing surface temperatures even higher. Plants die of thirst, losing shade, which further increases the temperature. That's why climate scientists, like Dr. Park Williams from UCLA, warn that the damage doesn't follow a linear path. It increases exponentially. Each additional degree Celsius doesn't bring the same amount of damage. Each additional degree Celsius creates a far greater destructive force than the previous degree Celsius. The most dangerous thing about this type of complex drought is that it's so perfectly disguised. A storm with howling winds and shattering windows, that's a fast disaster, prompting immediate shelter. But a drought is a slow disaster. It creeps into life without a sound. When it begins, it just looks like a bad harvest or a long hot spell. But by the time society realizes the extent of the devastation, when food prices skyrocket and water supplies are cut off, the damage has already progressed to an irreversible, nonlinear stage. Science has deciphered the entire mechanism of the catastrophe. Warning reports have been on policymakers' desks for years. But if we understand how this machine of destruction operates, why will America still enter 2026 facing a record water shortage with virtually no agreed-upon water allocation plan? The entire economy, urban network, and survival of 40 million people in the American West are tied to a single piece of paper, the Colorado River Treaty of 1922. The problem with this piece of paper? It was signed during a decade of the most unusually heavy rainfall in 500 years. Legislators at the time looked at a temporarily expanding river and allocated 7 states 20 to 25% more water than the river could actually provide in the long term. From the moment the ink ran dry on the paper, the American West was built on a giant water Ponzi scheme. They squandered water that didn't exist in the future. In 2026, the bill for that illusion is due. Federal emergency operating guidelines expire this October, and the political system is completely paralyzed. In February and March, 7 states missed 2 consecutive deadlines to reach an agreement on sharing the deficit. A battle erupted. Upstream states refused to cut back, coldly arguing they couldn't release water that the sky hadn't given them. Downstream states, armed with the old first-come, first-served law, refused to sacrifice their share. Neither side would yield. A deadly deadlock could force the federal government to impose controls, triggering decades-long legal battles. But this wasn't a debate about hydrological engineering. It was a battle of power and systemic injustice. No one dared to speak the truth aloud on television. Agriculture consumes 80% of the river's water, yet farmers pay less than a tenth the price of water compared to urban households. The system is forcing people to bear the consequences of a misguided, subsidized industry. Even darker, 30 indigenous tribes legally own about 25% of the entire basin's water. But for a century, and even during the life-or-death negotiations of 2026, they have consistently been excluded from the decision-making process. There isn't enough water. And 20th century contracts can't command clouds to make rain. That's the cruelty of this crisis. Nature creates the shock, but it is humans and rotten power systems who decide who suffers. While politicians are busy arguing in air-conditioned meeting rooms, out there, the answers are being written in dust. When decision-makers are still divided on the future of water resources, where will the people who depend on those resources for their livelihoods go? America isn't collapsing from its skyscrapers or data centers. It's starting to collapse from the ground up, from the fragile topsoil that sustains 330 million people. The agricultural crisis doesn't begin when you see empty supermarket shelves or skyrocketing bread prices. It starts much earlier, right here in these fields, in life-or-death decisions that no economic model can foresee. In April 2026, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Crop Progress Report will no longer be an economic news item. It will be an indictment. Winter wheat, a crop planted in the fall to be harvested in the summer, is dying of thirst. The percentage of crops achieving good to excellent grades has plummeted, a dramatic drop compared to the same period last year. 95% of the country's cotton acreage is currently in drought conditions. But the real cruelty isn't in the dying trees, it's in the people being forced into a gamble they can't win. When the sky refuses to send rain, farmers have only 2 choices, and both lead to bankruptcy. The first choice, pay tens of thousands of dollars to drill deeper wells, bearing the exorbitant energy costs to pump the last bit of fossilized groundwater to irrigate a crop whose selling price won't even cover the costs. The second choice, walk away, abandon the fields, watch their entire fortune and generations of livelihood turn to dust. That's what more than 70% of cotton farmers in Texas had to do during the 2022 disaster, and now that scenario is repeating itself on a more devastating scale. And this isn't just a tragedy for America alone, it's a piece of the ticking time bomb of global food security. If the American agricultural machine collapses due to the 2026 complex drought, while El Niño is simultaneously scorching wheat and rice fields in India and Southeast Asia, the world will simultaneously suffer a supply shock from the 2 largest continents. Crop failure isn't simply a few % drop in yield. True crop failure is when farmers completely lose faith in the viability of the next crop. When one farmer decides not to sow for the next season, the entire system begins to break down. If food is where this crisis manifests itself earliest and most clearly, then behind those parched fields, whose communities' lives are collapsing first? Look at this man again. 15 minutes ago, he was just the opening image for a terrible weather report. But now, when you understand the West's enormous water bank and the collapse of the climate system, you'll realize the dried-up pond at his feet isn't an isolated phenomenon. It's the final outlet of a chain of faults. When the snow cover on that mountaintop crumbles at the wrong time, this pond is the first to pay the price. People rooted in the high mountains like Walden don't measure time with paper calendars. They observe the workings of the seasons through the breathing of the earth, by the last frost, by the sound of melting ice, by the first green of the grass. But this year, the earth is speaking a completely unfamiliar language. Winter has refused to do its job of storing water. Spring arrived like a scorching fever, so tricking the plants into waking only to burn them to ashes shortly afterward. Familiarity, which had once provided a sense of security, had completely vanished. This was the first face of vulnerability, the breakdown of surface water sources. Farmers couldn't command the water to flow. When local river systems and small reservoirs emptied, they had no data center to analyze the situation, no backup pipelines from other states. They were directly exposed to the full force of the complex drought without any shield. We often think of a crisis as the tap in a city apartment stopping or the supermarket posting a food restriction notice. But no, the real crisis begins much earlier. It begins here, when the communities closest to the land, the ones who understand nature best, suddenly no longer recognize the sky above their heads. The surface water has betrayed them. Winter has refused to hold back its water. But if the mountains no longer have water to give, what will the vast plains, which depend on the enormous amount of water hidden deep beneath the earth, use to compensate? When the sky refuses to send rain and the rivers turn to sand, the great agriculture of the American plains doesn't die immediately. It survives thanks to a hidden miracle. Beneath the arid soil of 8 states, stretching from South Dakota to the tip of Texas, lies Ogallala Aquifer, North America's largest aquifer. It's the continent's backup battery, an invisible ocean containing fossilized water accumulated since the Ice Age. It has sustained America for the past 70 years, but this fossilized water is like oil. It's finite. The Ogallala's natural recirculation rate is only a few inches per year, while tens of thousands of industrial pumps are draining hundreds of feet of water. We're taking from an account that will never be replenished. In 2026, when 99% of Oklahoma and 89% of Texas are submerged in surface drought, and farmers are being forced to pump at full capacity. This immense suction is occurring precisely when groundwater levels are at their lowest on record. Reports from the U.S. Geological Survey, USGS, confirm that in West Texas, many boreholes have hit rock bottom, the machines roaring but pumping only air. Like ranchers in Colorado, farming families in the Texas Pancake region are caught in a bloody choice. They can gamble, borrow between $15,000 and $50,000 to drill deeper wells, hoping to find the last drops of water to save a dying crop. Or they can give up, switching to dryland farming, almost tantamount to suicide in the extreme heat of 2026, or selling the land their ancestors have held for 4 generations. And when the wells dry up, what evaporates with it isn't just the crops, it's an entire social structure. Without water, and farms close. Without farms, local banks fail, rural schools run out of students, hospitals withdraw due to lack of revenue. This isn't a noisy storm evacuation on the news. This is America's most silent, most painful wave of climate migration. With each drought, more families are quietly wiped off the map, while the rural plains are dying of thirst and eroding from beneath the surface. If surface water from the mountains has dried up and groundwater from the plains is no longer a lifeline, then where are the megacities, with their explosively rapid population growth, ultimately getting their water from? Welcome to Phoenix, Arizona, a marvel of 20th century engineering and a mad test of humanity in the 21st century. This is one of America's fastest growing megacities, with over 5 million inhabitants, built entirely in the middle of the desert. Phoenix survives thanks to a complex network that draws blood from the Colorado River, groundwater, and recycled water. But that pride is crashing against an insurmountable physical wall. The truth has begun knocking on the doors of the suburbs. Construction contractors are now being forced to prove their projects have a guaranteed water supply for the next 100 years, and many projects have been rejected. For the first time in history, a state has had to slam on real estate development because it can't print water. But the cruelest paradox lies here. While residential areas are being squeezed for water, a series of massive AI data centers are springing up. Each facility consumes millions of gallons of clean water daily just to cool its servers. We are pouring the desert's last lifeline into cooling computers. Computers running models that predict we will run out of water. But if you think this risk is only for the arrogant city builders in the desert, you're wrong. On April 20th, 2026, hundreds of passengers on an Amtrak train traveling through North Florida found themselves trapped in a sea of fire. Burning forests surrounded the tracks. Florida, a tourist paradise bordered by two oceans, should be the wettest land in America. But under the pressure of the complex drought, its infrastructure was overwhelmed by a disaster no engineer designed to prevent. The railroad was choked not by floods or storms, but by a wildfire in the middle of April. Phoenix and Florida. Two lands, two ecosystems, yet two versions of the same collapse. Phoenix exposes the ruthless limits of growth in a place already scarce in water. Florida proves that even places seemingly never-ending water scarcity are no longer immune. Both are monumental infrastructure systems, but both were designed for a world of the past. In the world of 2026, neither is an exception. If the mountains of the West, the plains of the Central, the deserts of the South, and the swamps of the East all are simultaneously sending out distress signals, then this is no longer just a year of unusual weather, and this is the starting point of a new era. And the question is, what will the price be? Much of the media and politicians are clinging to a name for self-consolation: the Dust Bowl. They compare 2026 to 1934 for a very simple psychological reason. The Dust Bowl disaster is over, and America survived. But that comparison is not only wrong, it is extremely dangerous. It sows the illusion that if we keep trying to hold on, the rain will return. The truth, according to CMIP6 climate models, is that the Dust Bowl ended because the La Niña cycle ended in a stable climate. The 2026 crisis, however, is occurring in a climate that has been permanently forced. Each subsequent decade will only be drier and hotter than the previous one. There are three core differences that make 2026 a completely different kind of monster. First, population. In 1934, the American West was a barren wasteland. In 2026, we will have 40 million people living parasitically on a drying Colorado River. Secondly, infrastructure lock-in. In the past, when land died, farmers loaded their belongings onto Fords and left. Today, you can't uproot trillion-dollar megacities like Las Vegas or Los Angeles. You can't relocate tens of thousands of miles of pipelines, power grids, and massive data centers. The tipping point of a civilization never happens in a single day. It's the accumulation of thousands of small, misguided decisions. Who is allowed to build where? What kind of trees are allowed to be planted? And how water prices are determined. And all those decisions of the 20th century were made based on a single assumption: that tomorrow's climate will be exactly the same as yesterday's. 2026 is the year that assumption officially crumbles. Now, not in thick scientific reports, but shattered in the daily lives of tens of millions of people. What we are paying today is not the bill for the weather. It's the bill for a century of illusion. The water crisis doesn't begin when the tap in your house stops running. It begins when a society continues to cling to old habits, even as the physical world around it has completely changed. The first question, about water. When the agreement to operate the Colorado River expires on October 1st, 2026, and 7 states are still fighting over every drop of water, who will decide who gets water first? And in that cruel division, who will protect the rights of the indigenous tribes who have been marginalized since 1922? The second question, about food. If America loses its great crop this year and El Niño continues to scorch Asia, How quickly will this global supply shock translate into prices? And in a world of shortages, which classes will be the first to suffer hunger? And the final question? About location. Phoenix, Las Vegas, or the burning swamps of Florida? In an America with fewer countries and more disasters, who will have enough money, enough policies, and enough privileges to be allowed to stay? The drought doesn't care about election cycles. It doesn't care about negotiation deadlines or the pace of new suburban home sales. It just keeps moving forward. And it will continue to test whether America is ready to live in its own new reality.